For a brief moment in the early hours of July 5th, it appeared that Vallejo police may have detained someone connected to the Blue Rock Springs shooting, but that impression did not survive closer examination. A man called Andrew's detention was driven by timing and proximity, not by evidence. As officers approached his vehicle, Andrew made an unsolicited remark. He asked, "Is this about that guy laying down back there?" The statement suggested awareness of something having happened nearby, but it was not an admission of guilt. Once Andrew and his companion were taken to the Vallejo Police Department, investigators began the standard verification process. His vehicle had already been searched at the scene, no firearm was located, no ammunition was found, nothing connected Andrews or his car to a shooting. Just as importantly, Andrews' remark did not evolve into a confession. He provided no detailed account, no explanation, and no statement placing himself at the scene of the shooting itself. Investigators also had to consider context. It was shortly after midnight on the 4th of July, a night filled with fireworks, noise, alcohol, and confusion. Awareness that someone was laying down in the area did not establish involvement in a violent crime. As police attention returned to the actual crime scene, witness timelines, and emerging evidence, Andrews could not be placed in the Blue Rock Springs parking lot at the time of the shooting in any provable way. With no weapon, no forensic link, and no corroboration, the detention quickly collapsed. This became the first example in the Blue Rock Springs investigation of a lead that seemed significant in the moment but disappeared once facts were tested. In the earliest hours after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, Vallejo police were not working from a list of suspects in the modern sense. Instead, they were identifying early persons of interest and witnesses, people whose names surfaced simply because of their proximity to Darlene Ferrin and the circumstances of her life. One of the first such names came directly from Darlene's family. At approximately 6:55 a.m., just hours after the shooting, Darlene's sister Linda arrived at Blue Rock Springs with her husband Stephen. They spoke with Vallejo police at the scene. During that conversation, Linda mentioned a man named George. According to Linda, George had repeatedly tried to date Darlene. She said Darlene did not particularly like him, but remained friendly toward him and consistently refused his advances. Linda told police that George visited Darlene frequently and was highly emotional. When Darlene didn't pay attention to him, George would become upset, what Linda described as uptight. She also provided a physical and behavioral description. George was short, stocky, dark-haired, and a very neat dresser. Linda stated that George owned a pink pickup truck and a brown car she believed to be a Chevrolet Corvair. At this point in the investigation, police were still asking a basic question. Was this attack personal? Names like George entered the record not because of evidence, but because investigators were methodically examining the victim's personal circle. There is no indication in the reports that George was arrested or charged, or that physical evidence linked him to the shooting. His name appears solely as an early person of interest, and as a reflection of how police initially understood what had happened at Blue Rock Springs. As the investigation expanded beyond Darlene Ferrin's immediate circle, Vallejo police began documenting witnesses whose proximity to Blue Rock Springs placed them near the sound and movement of the crime itself. One of those individuals came forward the evening of July 5th. At approximately 7:55 p.m., a 22-year-old white male named George R. Bryant arrived at the Vallejo Police Department. Bryant was employed at the Selby Skelly refinery. More importantly, his father was the caretaker of Blue Rock Springs Park. George told police that he lived with his father in the caretaker's house, a residence located approximately 800 feet from the parking lot at Blue Rock Springs. According to Bryant, at around 11:30 p.m. on the night of July 4th, his father went to bed and all the lights in the house were turned off. George stated that he was unable to sleep. He reversed the pillow on his bed, laid on his stomach, and looked out the window. From inside the darkened house, George said he could hear laughing coming from the park area, along with what sounded like a few firecrackers being set off. He could not see anyone. At approximately midnight, George reported hearing a sound he believed was a gunshot, noticeably louder than the firecrackers he had heard earlier. A short time later, he heard what sounded like another gunshot. After another brief pause, he then heard what he described as rapid fire, multiple gunshots in quick succession. Immediately afterward, George said he heard a car accelerate away at extremely high speed. He described the sound of burning rubber and squealing tires as the vehicle sped along the road, though he was unsure of its direction of travel. George told police that he did not investigate or call authorities at the time. It was the 4th of July, and he assumed the noises were simply part of holiday celebrations. George R. Bryant was not identified as a suspect. His statement was taken as a witness account, one that placed gunfire and a fleeing vehicle within earshot of the caretaker's residence at Blue Rock Springs. As part of the immediate, methodical response to the shooting, Vallejo police also began notifying and interviewing Darlene Ferrin's family, not only to inform them of what had happened, but to understand Darlene's state of mind in the days and weeks before her death. At approximately 11:15 p.m., Officer Lynch, accompanied by Sergeant Rust, went to 130 Jordan Street to contact Mr. and Mrs. Leo Suenin, Darlene Ferrin's parents. During that conversation, Mr. and Mrs. Suenin told officers that, to their knowledge, Darlene had no known enemies. They did not report any specific threats or individuals they believed capable of harming her. However, they did relay one detail that investigators documented carefully. They stated that at times, Darlene appeared to be afraid of Michael Mageau, the young man who had been with her at Blue Rock Springs that night. According to her parents, Darlene had told them that Mageau once claimed he was wanted by the FBI in New York City. She later learned that this was not true, that Mageau had admitted he made the statement as a joke, using it as a way to get acquainted with her. Vallejo police recorded this information as part of their early effort to understand relationships, perceptions, and possible tensions surrounding the victim. There is no indication in the reports that this statement shifted the investigation toward Mageau as a suspect. Rather, it reflects the breadth of routine inquiries conducted in the first hours of the case, even when a surviving victim was involved. As the investigation continued into the early morning hours of July 6th, Vallejo police expanded their interviews to include the family of the surviving victim. At approximately 12:02 a.m. on July 6, 1969, officers went to 864 Meadowood and contacted Carmen Mageau, the mother of Michael Mageau. The interview was conducted by Officer Lynch and Sergeant Rust. Mrs. Mageau told police that she was divorced from Michael's father, Robert Mageau, and that she was currently living in Southern California. After learning that her son had been shot, she traveled to Vallejo on July 5th, bringing with her her two other children, Michael's twin brother and a younger son. During the interview, Mrs. Mageau stated that to her knowledge, Michael had no known enemies. She told officers she could offer no information that might explain who would have wanted to shoot him or why. At this time, Stephen Mageau and his brother returned to the residence at 864 Beechwood Street. Stephen told officers that he did not get along well with his father and that approximately 3 weeks earlier he had gone to Southern California to live with his mother. Stephen stated that he knew Darlene Ferrin and got along well with her. He said he was not aware of any enemies Darlene or his brother Michael might have had. He also told officers that he and Michael were close and that if anything serious had been wrong, he was confident his brother would have told him. After officers returned to the station, Stephen Mageau phoned with additional information. He stated that several months earlier, Darlene had told him and his brother about an incident involving a man she referred to as George. According to Stephen, Darlene said that George had broken into her apartment and told her he was going to rape her. Darlene claimed she was able to talk him out of it. Stephen said that at the time, neither he nor his brother took the statement seriously, and they did not think about it again. This information was documented after the fact and added to the case record. Later that evening, at approximately 7:45 p.m., a woman named Judith Anita, age 25, came to the Vallejo Police Department. She told officers that she had previously been a close friend of Darlene's when they worked together at Terry's on Highway 40. Judith stated that about 4 months earlier, she and Darlene had gone to the movies together. Afterward, they stopped by the restaurant where Dean Ferrin was working. Darlene asked Dean to take them to the Coronado Inn. Dean refused, and the two got into what Judith described as a fairly large argument. Judith said she did not want to become involved in that dispute, and that afterward she saw Darlene only infrequently. At the time of the interview, Judith said she was working at Terry's on Tennessee Street. She stated that she knew of no enemies Darlene might have had. Judith also told police that Bobby Ramos was a close friend of Darlene's and might have information relevant to the investigation. She stated that she did not know anyone named George and was not aware of any such person in Darlene's life. Finally, at approximately 8:05 p.m., Robert W. Mago, age 43, came to the police station. Robert told officers that he did not know Darlene Ferrin personally, but said that she phoned his son, Michael, every day, sometimes several times a day. He stated that his ex-wife, Carmen Majo, had met Darlene and approved of her. Robert told police that he could add nothing further to assist in the investigation. On the evening of July 6th, at approximately 6:15 p.m., Sergeant Rust received information from Bill Lee, the employer of Terry, regarding the identities of 2 teenage girls who had babysat for Darlene Ferrin on Friday, July 4th. Using that information, officers contacted the girls' parents and requested that they bring them to the Vallejo Police Department. Both girls arrived at approximately 6:45 p.m., accompanied by their fathers, and were interviewed in the reporting officer's office. The girls were identified as Jackie May, age 17, and Janet Lynn, also 17. Jackie stated that she had done the actual babysitting and that this was the first time she had ever babysat for Darlene, although she had known her slightly before. Janet explained that she was not babysitting. She had simply come along to keep Jackie company. The girls told police that at approximately 7 p.m., Darlene's husband picked them up, along with Darlene's sister, Christine. They were taken to Darlene's residence at 1300 Virginia Street, where they were met by Darlene herself. According to the girls, Darlene and Christine were planning to attend 4th of July festivities downtown. Darlene told them she would be back by 10 p.m., and the two sisters left the house at approximately 7:45 p.m. Before leaving, Darlene also mentioned that she planned to go to San Francisco later that night, though she did not say with whom or for what reason. While Darlene was gone, a phone call came into the house. Janet answered and was asked to relay a message for Darlene to come to Terry's the next time she worked. This message was passed along when Darlene called the house at approximately 9 p.m. The girls stated that Darlene did not return home until about 11:30 p.m. or shortly before. When she arrived, she told them she had changed her mind about going to San Francisco and instead planned to have a small party when her husband got home. Darlene spent a few minutes cleaning the house. She then told the girls she was going out to buy fireworks and other items for the party and said she would be back by approximately 12:30 a.m. Darlene left the house at around 11:40 p.m. The girls never saw her again. At approximately 12:30 a.m., Darlene's husband returned home with several friends. The girls told him what Darlene had said about going out for fireworks. According to the girls, he did not appear worried and remarked that Darlene was often late. Shortly before 2 a.m., Darlene's husband drove the two girls home and reportedly planned to return to the house afterward. Both girls told police that they were not close to Darlene and could offer no additional information. Their statements were recorded as part of the effort to establish a precise timeline of Darlene Ferrin's final movements. By the morning of July 7th, Vallejo police were still methodically working outward, from the crime scene to family to coworkers, attempting to understand Darlene Ferrin's life in the days and hours before her death. At approximately 11:30 a.m. on July 7, 1969, investigators contacted Bill Lee, the owner of Caesar's Palace Italian restaurant, where Darlene's husband, Dean Ferrin, was employed. Bill Lee told police that on Friday, July 4th, the restaurant was open as usual. He stated that Dean Ferrin reported for work as an assistant cook at approximately 3:45 p.m. and did not leave the business for any reason until closing time. Lee said that when the restaurant closed, he and Dean left separately to attend a party at Dean's residence at 1300 Virginia Street. He stated that both men stopped at Pete's liquor store to purchase drinks for the party and then proceeded directly to the house in separate vehicles. When they arrived, they were informed that Darlene was not home and that she had told the babysitters she would return by 12:30 a.m. Bill Lee stated that Dean then took the babysitters home and returned shortly afterward. Lee told police that he knew of no reason anyone would want to kill Darlene. However, he went on to say that she was running around a lot and was seeing other men, though he could not provide names, dates, or specific locations. He stated that Darlene often stayed out late, sometimes until early morning hours, and that some of his friends had seen her in different places with other men. Lee emphasized that Dean allowed Darlene considerable freedom and did not believe she was doing anything wrong. Bill Lee then mentioned a man known to him only as George. He stated that Dean had previously sold George a 1951 Ford pickup truck. According to Lee, this George had tried repeatedly to get Darlene to go out with him, and she consistently refused. Lee told police that George became very upset over these refusals, describing him as ill-tempered, sarcastic, mean, and bitter. He said George grew increasingly hostile about the fact that Darlene would not have anything to do with him. Lee stated that he had never personally met George and did not know where he lived or worked, but had heard that George was a bartender. He also said he had heard that George used to visit Darlene at her home on Virginia Street in an attempt to pick her up. This interview added to a growing pattern in the early investigation. Multiple independent accounts describing a man named George as emotionally fixated on Darlene Ferrin and increasingly angry over her refusal to date him. Later that same day, investigators returned to Darlene Ferrin's home at 1300 Virginia Street to speak directly with her husband, Dean Ferrin, about a name that was now appearing repeatedly in the investigation: George. At approximately 4:20 p.m., Dean Ferrin was questioned specifically about this individual. Dean told officers that he had only met George once. According to Dean, he previously owned a 1951 Ford half-ton pickup truck, faded red in color. When he decided to sell the truck, his wife mentioned it to George, and George ultimately purchased it. Dean stated that when George came to buy the truck, Darlene introduced the two men to each other. Dean described George as approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, with a stocky build, a dark complexion, and what he described as a Mexican appearance. Dean told police that George had been employed as a bartender but had lost that job. He also stated that on occasion George gave Darlene rides to work. Dean emphasized that he had no reason to believe his wife was involved with George in any romantic way. This interview marked one of the first times investigators were able to document a direct description of George from within Darlene Ferrin's household, further solidifying him as a recurring early person of interest in the Blue Rock Springs investigation. By July 8, 1969, Vallejo police were continuing to follow up on recurring names that had surfaced in earlier interviews, particularly a man identified only as George. On that day, investigators interviewed Stephen Mageau, the twin brother of Michael Mageau. Stephen told police that he did not know George personally, but that he had spoken many times with both Michael and Darlene about him. According to Stephen, George was constantly bothering Darlene and had followed her on multiple occasions. He stated that Darlene was deathly afraid of George, but deliberately remained friendly toward him in an effort to keep him at a distance and avoid provoking him. Stephen told police that on one occasion, Darlene walked into her apartment and told him that George had either said he was going to rape her or force her into bed one way or another. Stephen stated that Darlene had told Michael about this incident, and that Michael later relayed the information to him. According to Stephen, Darlene also said that she was able to talk George out of causing any trouble, and that he eventually left the apartment without harming her. This interview added further weight to a pattern already emerging in the investigation: repeated independent accounts describing a man named George as persistently pursuing Darlene Ferrin, following her and instilling genuine fear in her prior to the Blue Rock Springs shooting. During that same interview, Stephen Mageau also provided investigators with additional context about Darlene Ferrin's habits and routines. Stephen told police that Darlene often went to Blue Rock Springs at night with boyfriends. He stated that this was not unusual behavior and that it was common knowledge among her friends that Blue Rock Springs was her favorite place to go in the evenings. This statement was documented by investigators as part of their effort to understand whether the location itself, rather than a specific date or circumstance, may have played a role in what happened that night. At this stage of the investigation, Blue Rock Springs was still viewed not as a symbolic crime scene, but as a familiar and frequently visited location in Darlene Ferrin's social life. Later that afternoon, investigators continued canvassing Darlene Ferrin's workplace in an effort to identify additional relationships that might help explain her movements and associations. At approximately 3:55 p.m., accompanied by Sergeant Rust, Officer Lynch contacted Bobby, a waitress employed at Terry's restaurant. Bobby told police that Darlene had a friend who was either in the Navy or stationed at the Maritime Academy. She stated that this man had been sent to Idaho for training. Before he left, Bobby said he and Darlene made plans that once he saved enough money, he would send for her so she could join him. Bobby stated that Darlene received several letters from this man, though she did not know whether he had ever sent her any money. She was unable to describe what kind of car he drove. She did state, however, that Darlene had gone to San Francisco with him. Bobby also provided additional information regarding George. She told police that the last time she saw George was approximately a month and a half earlier. On that occasion, he came into the restaurant with another girl. She stated that prior to that, George had been coming in almost every night. Bobby said that George had driven Darlene to work many times. Finally, Bobby told officers that aside from George, the only other close friend Darlene had was a man named Richard, who drove a white Cougar. This interview further broadened the picture investigators were building, one that included multiple social connections, regular transportation assistance from George, and at least 2 other male associates whose identities and movements would need to be accounted for. By July 11, 1969, Vallejo police had accumulated enough independent statements about a man known as George that they made direct contact with him. On the evening of July 11th at approximately 8:15 p.m., Officer Lynch, accompanied by Sergeant Rust, traveled to Yountville and interviewed George, last name withheld, a white male, 29 years old. George told police that he was employed as a bookkeeper and office manager. He stated that he was born in Manila in the Philippine Islands and was not a citizen of the United States. He said he wore glasses for reading. Officers described him as approximately 5 feet 9 inches tall, with an olive complexion, black hair, brown eyes, and a medium build, slightly overweight. He stated that he was married and that his wife's name was Judith. George told police that he had previously worked part-time as a bartender at several Vallejo bars, including the Hike, Casa de Vallejo, Kentville, and the Fireside. He also stated that he had been employed at the Pastime Club in Benicia from January through early March of that year, quitting on March 9th to begin training as a boilermaker at Kaiser Steel. After completing 12 weeks of training, he said he was laid off. George discussed his vehicle history in detail. He stated that within the past year he had owned a blue over white 1956 Chevrolet, a pink 1951 Ford pickup, which he said he purchased from Dean Ferrin, and a maroon 1964 Pontiac Bonneville. He stated that he had never owned a Chevrolet Corvair, and to the best of his recollection had never borrowed one. George told police that he became acquainted with Darlene Ferrin around the beginning of the year. He said he referred to her as Dee Dee, and that he would tease her at Terry's restaurant, sometimes to the point where she became angry. He stated that it was his habit to go to Terry's for breakfast after the bars closed at 2 a.m., and that he would often give Darlene a ride home at the end of her shift. He also stated that many times Darlene called him and asked him for a ride to work. George said that he had visited Darlene at her residence when she lived behind the Plaza restaurant near Highway 40, but stated that he had never visited her home at 1300 Virginia Street. He told police that he had only met Darlene's husband once, when he purchased the pickup truck. George denied ever threatening Darlene. He acknowledged teasing her and making her angry at times, but denied any hostile intent. He described Darlene as a very capable waitress who had many friends, though he said he knew most of them only by sight and not by name. George stated that the last time he saw Darlene was approximately a month and a half earlier, when he stopped at Terry's with his wife to eat. He said he joked with Darlene briefly, but noted that she seemed unusually quiet that evening. He told police that he did not know Darlene's close friends, but believed she often went to the Coronado Inn when she went out, usually with girlfriends. He stated that he did not own a gun and had never been to Blue Rock Springs with Darlene. George also provided an account of his activities on July 4th. He stated that he managed a girls' softball team in Yountville and that the team, sponsored by the Napa Police Department, played a game in Napa at approximately 10:30 that morning. After the game, he returned home and took a nap, then later went to the fair in Calistoga. He said he returned home around 7 p.m. and later that evening attended a fireworks display at the Veterans Home with his wife. He stated they returned home at approximately 11 p.m. and that he did not leave the house after that. George told police that during the time he was seeing Darlene, he was single and that he was never seriously involved with her because he knew she was married. This interview represented the first comprehensive statement from the man whose name had appeared repeatedly in the early investigation, allowing police to formally document his background, his relationship with Darlene Ferrin, and his account of his movements on the night of the Blue Rock Springs shooting. Investigators contacted Pamela, the sister of murdered Darlene Ferrin. Pamela was asked whether she knew of anyone her sister had associated with whose name matched one investigators were attempting to identify. Pamela told police that several months before the murder, she had been babysitting at Darlene's apartment when she received a phone call from a man asking to speak to her sister. Pamela told the caller that Darlene was not home. According to Pamela, the man stated that it was very important that Darlene meet with him. He then left his name and asked that Darlene contact him. Pamela told police that she believed the man gave the name Dave, though she was uncertain. Pamela said she relayed the message to her sister. Darlene's response, according to Pamela, was immediate and clear. She said she did not want to have anything to do with the man and told her sister to forget about it. The reporting officer noted that the possibility of suggestion may have influenced Pamela's recollection, and the name was treated cautiously rather than as a confirmed lead. Investigators also interviewed Darlene's younger sister, Christine, at her home. Christine told police that she did not recognize the specific name investigators asked about. However, she did recall an incident that stood out to her from several months earlier. Christine stated that while she was babysitting at her sister's apartment, a white male came to the door asking to see Darlene. When Christine told him that her sister was not at home, the man left the area. Christine recalled that the man was driving a late-model blue GTO. She described him as approximately 30 years old, about 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighing between 165 and 170 pounds, with dark brown hair and casually dressed. Christine told police that she did not recall the man giving his name, and if a name was given, she could not remember it. This account was documented as another instance of an unidentified male attempting to make direct contact with Darlene at her residence, adding to a growing collection of partial descriptions and unconfirmed encounters recorded during the investigation. By early September of 1969, Vallejo police were still identifying and formally documenting men who had been close to Darlene Ferrin in the months before her death, including one individual whose name had surfaced repeatedly as a former romantic interest. On September 1st, 1969, at approximately 11 p.m., a man identified as Gordon, last name redacted, a 21-year-old white male and active duty member of the United States Navy, contacted police at the Vallejo station. Gordon was on leave at the time, having recently been assigned to the Naval Submarine School in New London, Connecticut. Gordon was identified by investigators as the individual previously referenced in reports as a friend of Darlene Ferrin. He told officers that he had recently been released from the Naval School's Command Nuclear Power School in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and had traveled from his parents' home in Pittsburgh to Vallejo. While there, he decided to stop at Terry's restaurant to see Darlene, only to be informed by a waitress that she had been killed and that police wished to speak with him. He then reported directly to the station. Gordon stated that he first met Darlene, whom he referred to as D, at Terry's on Magazine Street in December of 1968 while she was working there. He described her as very friendly. About a month later, he said they went to San Francisco with other friends, walked along the beach, and talked. Gordon stated that after this, they went out on several dates. He said he would sometimes pick her up after work, take her out briefly, and then drive her home. He told police that in late January or early February of 1969, shortly before he was transferred to Idaho Falls, he picked Darlene up from work at approximately 1 a.m., and the two went to Blue Rock Springs for a short time. He stated that he brought her home between 1:30 and 2 a.m. Gordon said that Darlene insisted he come inside the apartment to meet her husband. This residence was on Lincoln Road West, near Jack's hangout. Gordon stated that he eventually agreed, was introduced to Darlene's husband, whom he described as friendly, and then left shortly afterward. Gordon stated that the next time he saw Darlene was 1 or 2 days before he left for Idaho Falls. He picked her up after work at her home, noting that she had gotten off early and that her husband knew she was going out with him. He said they went to a dance venue in either San Francisco or Oakland, and that he brought her home around 1 a.m. He stated that Darlene's baby had been left at her mother's house that night, and that he went inside and met her parents. Gordon told police that during this period, Darlene had expressed a desire to leave her husband and go with him to Idaho Falls. He stated that he talked her out of it, citing concern for her child and his inability to support such a move. After he arrived in Idaho Falls, Gordon stated that he received 2 or 3 letters from Darlene. In one of them, she asked him to call her. He stated that he did call, and during that conversation, Darlene told him she believed she was pregnant. Gordon said he told her he would come to see her in May when he was next on leave. Gordon stated that he later received another letter from Darlene indicating that she had been in the hospital for a short time, though no reason was given. He said he believed it was possible she had been pregnant and had obtained an abortion. Gordon told police that at this point he decided not to have any further involvement with Darlene and not to see her again. He stated that when he later went on leave, he did not come to Vallejo, did not contact her, and returned instead to his home in Fremont before going back to Idaho Falls. Gordon stated that he had not seen Darlene since February, had only spoken to her once or twice on the phone, and had written only 1 or 2 letters. He emphasized that he did not consider the relationship serious, that it was more serious on her part than on his, and that he never sent her money, never invited her to Idaho Falls, and never asked her to come live with him. Gordon told police that he would remain at his parents' home in Fremont until the end of the week before driving back to New London, Connecticut, and that he would cooperate fully with the Vallejo Police Department if he was able to provide any additional information. The interview was then terminated. Before we close this episode, there's something important that needs to be said about what you've just heard and what you haven't. In the weeks and months following the Blue Rock Springs shooting, Vallejo police received a steady stream of reports. Friends suspected friends. Neighbors suspected neighbors. Co-workers, relatives, and acquaintances all put forward names they believed might somehow be connected to Darlene Ferrin's death. There were far more persons of interest than any single episode could reasonably cover. Many of those names appeared only once. Some were based on rumor, misunderstanding, or hindsight. Others came from people trying to make sense of a shocking crime by fitting it into what they thought they already knew. Police did what police always do in those situations. They documented the information, checked what could be checked, and quietly eliminated what didn't hold up. Almost all of those leads went nowhere. They fizzled out, not dramatically, but procedurally. The individuals we chose to focus on in this episode were not selected because they were guilty, or even because they were the most suspicious. They were chosen for one reason only. They appear repeatedly in the record. These were the names that surfaced again and again, from different witnesses at different times, through independent statements. They generated follow-up. They generated interviews. They left a paper trail that allows us to understand how the investigation actually unfolded. This episode wasn't about identifying a killer. It was about showing you how police tried and how difficult that task already was, even before the Zodiac letters arrived and changed everything. Blue Rock Springs did not suffer from a lack of suspects. It suffered from a lack of answers. Before we leave Blue Rock Springs, there is one final name that needs to be acknowledged. Not because it belongs to this phase of the investigation, but because it looms over what comes next. There was another man in Darlene Ferrin's life who would eventually be arrested on suspicion of murder. His name was James Phillips, Darlene's ex-husband. But police do not arrive at James Phillips until much later. Not in the chaotic hours after the shooting. Not during the early wave of witnesses and persons of interest. James Phillips is not arrested until February 2nd, 1970. By then, everything has changed. There are more murders. Letters have begun arriving. And the investigation is no longer focused on a single lover's lane in Vallejo. For now, James Phillips remains outside the frame of this episode, a suspect from the future, not the past. We'll come back to him when the investigation finally does. So that's where the Blue Rock Springs investigation stood in its earliest phase. What you've heard isn't theory. It isn't hindsight. It's the raw accumulation of police interviews, false starts, credible concerns, and leads that went nowhere, all before anyone had even heard the name Zodiac. At this point, the investigation isn't failing. It's narrowing, and that process is rarely neat. This is where experience matters. Simon, Tom, you've both worked major investigations from the inside. You know what it looks like when police are flooded with information, when names repeat, when others quietly disappear, and when the absence of evidence becomes as important as what's found. Based solely on what Vallejo police knew at this stage, no letters, no later crimes, no hindsight, how would this investigation have looked to you?
Alex, thanks very much for that again. That's fantastic. And you give us so much to talk about and think about with these cases. It really is impressive. Tom, I was going to say to you about Alex's work. I've been looking at some of the Zodiac stuff on television. There was a film made, a documentary. There's so much out there. And with these unsolved murders, serial killers and mysteries, you always get all these conspiracies and all these people with their theories. What I love about Alex's work is that he only focuses on what we know. he focuses on the fact.
Yeah, I think that's right. I find that refreshing too. I found this episode very interesting because he goes right back and he talks about the basic investigation. I was actually pleased because the local police really did attack this in a structured way.
Yep.
When we've been looking at these old cases, you go back to the 1960s and you're expecting chaos. You go, oh no, surely you didn't do that. You're like, oh, was it really that bad back then? But actually, the local cops here really did tackle it in a structured way. But I'll tell you something, Simon.
Mm-hmm.
This fella, George.
Yeah.
I remember my old boss, Hector Clark, saying once in a case, a suspect for a murder, and he was such a good suspect because there was information coming in about him from so many sources.
Yeah, different.
That what he said was, look, we've got to tackle this in another way. We've not got to look at him and see whether there's evidence against him. What we've got to do is carry out a structured investigation to absolutely eliminate him. In other words, not prove it was him, but prove it wasn't him.
That's exactly what I wanted to pick your brains about tonight, Tom, because we're so lucky on Crime Time Inc. to have you, because you led these investigations. You led many murder investigations, some of them the most high profile in Scottish criminal history. So what I wanted to do was ask you to do our listeners a service here, because we're guilty, I think, of skipping across some of the procedural stuff that you and I take for granted because it was our bread and butter, working in murder squads and serious investigations. Mm-hmm. What I've written down here is TIE. Mm-hmm. Now, that was a core term in any murder squad because it's what we did, it's how we did it. Yeah. And it stands for trace, investigate, and eliminate. And I wanted you to take us through the thought process of that and how it was put in place in a murder incident room if you had a team of 20 or more detectives working on a case. What's the methodology here from an investigating officer's point of view?
We always called it trace, interview, eliminate, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing. A little difference in wordage from the east to the west coast of Scotland. Yeah, very important. And of course, very difficult to do sometimes. What you would do is generate actions. So in the incident room, whether it be Holmes, whether it be a computerised system or the old paper-based system, and don't forget, back in 1969, it would be a paper-based system. Probably very much like ours because it was used universally, as far as I know. So it would be a paper-based system. So they generate what they call an action from the admin, and the action would say, George such and such, trace, interview, eliminate, and there'd be a couple of statement references on it. These are handed out sometimes singly, sometimes at the beginning of an investigation. Sometimes you'd get 3 or 4 of these to an inquiry team of 2 officers, always of 2 officers. And you'll remember that what we tried to do is we tried to give an experienced hand and a younger person, or an experienced and less experienced person, to go away and first of all do their homework. Look at the statements and see why this person was being interviewed and why they were a person of interest in the investigation. So where their name had cropped up from. And then what would happen is they would trace them, they would gather information and interview them with the hope that they would eliminate them or not. Now, okay, so first of all, the interview, let's talk about that for a minute. In our early days, frankly, these interviews were unstructured. Mm. Some of them were a lot better than others. And a lot of it was intuitive stuff because we didn't get much formal interview training, not until much later on. Later on, when the Criminal Justice Scotland Act came in, and that was I should explain to our listeners that that's a piece of legislation which actually meant that you only had 6 hours in which to question someone once you detained them. Okay.
So 1981, Tom.
In 1981, that's right. Now, a lot of people were quite happy to sit down and talk to you all day, but some weren't. And for the people who weren't, you had to have your homework done. Because if you detained them, you only had 6 hours. And 6 hours wasn't long enough to just wing it. You had to actually have a plan, an interview plan. And we've discussed this before in another show, and like every other detective, I was absolutely, fear and loathing about the onset of the Criminal Justice Scotland Act and the 6 hours detention and all that meant. I thought it would be a license for criminals to get away with it. Actually, what it did, it made us better interviewers and it made us better planners as well. Sometimes these things come in and look like a tremendous encumbrance. Actually, they're making you more professional.
They made us focus, Tom, didn't they? Because you weren't going to waste your 6 hours. Because we should say you couldn't bring the same person in for another 6 hours without going through all sorts of loopholes with the fiscal and all the rest of it. So you only had that one shot at it. So you had to prepare properly.
Yes, you had to. And of course, the interviews were taped.
Yeah.
So you had to prepare properly for them and do a little bit of homework. You had to get better at things like body language and adapt your skills. And also, it was something which looked like an encumbrance, but actually professionalised, I think, the whole of the police service. So, okay, so that's Trace, and that's interview.
Sorry, Tom, while it crosses my mind, I think it made us work better as a team. As you say, there were always two. And because of taped interviews and the time pressure that we were under, it meant that there was one lead questioner. And the other guy learned to sit back and watch and listen and take notes. And it made the whole thing more effective in my mind.
It did. One of the big challenges very early on, just when you'd come back from the mortuary, when you'd taken the body of the deceased to the mortuary, you'd made sure all that was done properly and all the bits and pieces were recovered and all of that was set for you. Then what you had to do, the SIO and the deputy SIO used to have to sit down and actually work out what teams you were going to have on the operational side. Pick your admin team, and you always had an experienced admin sergeant to run the admin. Especially important before the days of Holmes, because the big advantage of Holmes was there was a fail-safe in it. The computer would not let you get away with making mistakes.
Yeah.
Whereas the old card system, you were very much dependent on the officers actually working the system. So you'd pick your admin team, and then you'd sit down and you'd look at your 10 names or your dozen names, and you'd say, right, okay, what's the pairings here? And you'd work it out, what the strengths and weaknesses of the various officers were, and you'd try and match them up.
Tell me something, Tom. If you'd seen Simon McLean on that list, would you have been delighted?
I would have been ecstatic. Did I sound sincere there?
It'll do for me.
I'm glad this is not videoed because my nose is growing. No, but the truth of the matter is, when your name appeared up on the screen, your SIOs would know what your strengths were.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you'd know what your weaknesses were. And I'm not saying the two lists of strengths and weaknesses would be the same size, Simon. I'm just saying that there would be two lists.
Size isn't everything, Tom.
But the next thing is eliminate. Now, this is the important bit.
Yeah.
Trace, interview, eliminate. The tracing, the interviewing is all doable. That's fine. The elimination is harder because, and the important thing about this is if you are saying that somebody's been eliminated, you take them out of the active part of the investigation. And the truth is that once you've passed someone over, it's really difficult to get back to them if you've made a mistake. Okay?
Yeah.
So in the days before electronics and CCTV and telephones and mobile phones, which can tell where you were at a certain time, you had to rely on alibi and you had to rely on other physical means of eliminating someone from the investigation. Now, if you had a fingerprint of the culprit, then you just need to take fingerprints, fine.
Yes. Yeah.
Latterly, if you had DNA, you would have DNA taken, and that could eliminate them. This is coming back to a conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, is that what all the naysayers forget is that fingerprints and DNA has eliminated innocent people just as much, maybe more, than it has the guilty. So anyway, elimination. So you would go back, where were you? I was at home with my wife. Well, I know Bosch used to say that alibis provided by partners and wives were worthless.
Yeah.
You know? And so you had to try and triangulate. You had to say, right, okay, so the wife is saying that she and the interviewee, the guy you're looking at to eliminate, were out at the cinema. What film did they see? What time did it show? Did anybody see them there? Is there a ticket? Is there a record of them being at the cinema? So you had to try and do all of that as well.
Yeah, just a wee thing in there, Tom, when we're talking about, because it's so detailed, this, you and I know how detailed this whole process is, and we could never cover every eventuality on a chat like this.
Yeah.
But when someone's detained, we can take the fingerprints, we can take their DNA, which is relevant now, if not then. We could take the photograph for the purposes of elimination or otherwise, but we had that 6 hours to do it in. It was just to clarify that wee point. Once someone's arrested and charged, then we can take all these things automatically. But we could also do it while they were detained. Whereas if they'd come in on a voluntary basis, which was often our way of not using the Section 2, we would, and it was a way of gauging the response. Would you come in and help us with our inquiries? Would you come in for a chat? And if they did willingly, then that helped towards making your mind up about them in some way. Whereas if you had to resort to the Section 2, they were becoming a suspect at that point.
Well, that's right. But there were some people, I remember coming across a guy, and much later, somebody said to me, did you not think, and I said, no, because this was one of the individuals who was just an awkward person. If you said black, he'd say white. If you asked him to come in and help you, he'd say no. You had to detain him. He was just one of these sort of people. Important to add to what you've just said, Simon, is that if you fingerprinted and photographed someone who was detained, you could not retain these fingerprints and photographs and put them on the criminal records thing. You had to destroy them. And of course, this was a subject of a lot of debate because a lot of the anti-police critics were saying the police say they'll do this, but they'll actually keep secret files and all this. In fact, we didn't. No. It was all done by a process and we played by rules.
We're diversifying here a wee bit, Tom, but if people understood the relationships that we had, I don't mean you and I, the police had, with experts such as fingerprint experts, such as the lab, scientists at the lab, the ballistics department, all these specialists, they were very specialist and they were very precious about keeping their integrity 100% intact, which it had to be for any future criminal proceedings, because you could never use a fingerprint or any other sample from someone that hadn't been stored properly and kept properly for that purpose. So if people understood that, they'd realise there couldn't be any secret caches.
No, they carried their professional pride and were very professionally conscious. And they would certainly not do anything else. Lastly on this, the eliminate thing. So at the end of the first week or so, you're left with a whole lot of people who you've traced, who you've interviewed, but who you have not managed to eliminate. And as these investigations run on and on, the long-running ones, you've got a fair few of these people who you've still got suspicions of, or at least you've not managed to eliminate entirely. And that's, of course, where I remember when DNA first came in, late 80s, we were trying to solve the World's End murders at that time. And, of course, it was later that we actually got a hold of Angus Sinclair, the culprit for that. But in the interim, what we did manage to do was to say that it wasn't A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It wasn't all these people that we'd had hanging on the files. We could say that. We couldn't say who it was. We could say who it wasn't.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yep. Tom, just to finish off on that, as a senior investigating officer, you would make the call when someone was going to be... Before I get to that, every night we would have a debrief, certainly in the murders that I was involved in with the squad through here. The senior investigating officer or his deputy would convene us, we'd have a cup of tea or whatever, a glass of water, and we would all get together, the whole inquiry team, usually including some of the admin staff that you're talking about, because they had an oversight of the case as well from their perspective. And the boss would then proceed to go round us and say, Simon and Joe, what did you have today? What were you doing? And we'd say, we were trying to trace and interview and eliminate Joe Boggs. How did you get on? And we would discuss it in front of the whole team. And other questions would come up. Other people would question us and say, did he have a scar? What was he with? Because that trace part was important too, Tom, because you usually got to meet other members of his circle or family. And that gave you an idea about how they felt about him and whether he was a liar, whether he was a good guy, whether he was a bad guy, etc., etc. So that debrief at night, we went through each individual day's work together so that nothing could, not nothing, but to minimise the chances of anything slipping through the net. And that could be the fact that he smokes Hamlet cigars or whatever.
Yeah, it could be. That was also a very good mechanism for keeping the team together and keeping up the esprit de corps. We've discussed this before. There's nothing like that first 24 hours, 36 hours on a murder team when you're on the hunt and you've got a job to do, and it's the most important job that the police service can do, and you feel, or you should feel, absolutely a compliment that you're on that team. It's a professional compliment that you're doing that job. And it's a tremendous esprit de corps. And these debriefs and the briefings in the morning and at night are hugely important to keep everybody in the picture.
Yeah. Even more so, Tom, when it becomes protracted, as you know better than anyone. 6 weeks, 6 months down the line, when you're still coming in every night and not getting that break that you feel as though you
and it's, if you can keep your first team together until you solve it, you've got a big advantage. If it gets to the stage where you're into 3, 4, 5, 6 months and old members of the team start dropping off because they've got other places to go, or because they're moving on, they're being promoted or something, and you've got to bring in people, fresh people into the team, then that's another challenge. Because that's a challenge of playing them in. And that's a different skill set, really, of matching them up with someone who is well versed in the investigation. And it was almost like a teaching course of the investigation and all the different twists and turns. And sometimes, I remember there's a famous quote from a very famous New York homicide captain, and he said, sometimes all you need is a new idea. And sometimes people coming in, they would provide a new idea and say, well, what have you thought about so-and-so? And what you had to be careful of is not to be dismissive, but to actually welcome that and look for new ideas from all sources, including uniformed cops who were attached, admin team. We had fantastic murder squad typists. There were a group of middle-aged ladies. If they're listening to this, they wouldn't mind me calling them that. Great girls, but they were on call for murder squads. And so they came out and that's all they did. They came out and they did these murder squads. And of course, they'd been on every murder squad since time immemorial. And most of them were married to policemen. So they had a great knowledge. And sometimes one of them would say, I see so-and-so, what about this? Or that reminds me of such and such so-and-so.
And they had local knowledge sometimes too, which was invaluable.
Very, absolutely.
That's before the Holmes teams, of course. When we had Holmes teams set up, they were always called into murders and became very much a team effort. Sometimes SIOs would team up a specific Holmes team because they knew that they worked well together.
Well, I mean, in Police Scotland now, they've got these major incident teams for major crime teams for different areas geographically. And I envy them tremendously because they're just all set up and ready to go, and they've got all the kits there, the people are there, they know who they're working with. And I've had conversations with some of them, the serving officers now, the detective supers and whatnot. I said, I don't know how you don't solve every murder in 24 hours. Look at the kit you've got compared with what we had. And of course, they always dismiss that.
Tom, just to finish up on the TIE then, you would make the call, you or your deputy, if you weren't there, when to interview. Because now we've realised, chatting here to our listeners, that the 6 hours is a very precious commodity that we have. We're never going to waste it. We don't want to bring someone in too early to interview, take his statement and let him go, especially if we have to use the 6 hours. What tips the balance then for you to say to the guys, to the two cops, detectives that are looking at him, bring him in, let's interview him?
Number of things. Sometimes there would be somebody who we were very interested in. The first thing we would do, we'd put a little surveillance exercise on them, find out what they were doing, find out who they were seeing, where they were going, what car they were driving, what their behaviours were like. And you would do that, you'd have a look at that, you consider it. One of the prime reasons, if they were starting to behave oddly, and it looked as if they were under pressure,
Hmm.
then that was the time to bring them in. Also, if you thought that they were going to, as old boss used to say, if you thought they were going to get on their toes, in other words,
Abscond.
clear off, yes.
Yeah.
If you thought that was going to happen, then you sprung the trap. But it depended, and it was an assessment. It was an
Yes,
assessment of when you struck. And you're absolutely right. Going too prematurely was a bad mistake.
Yeah.
Leaving it too long is a bad mistake.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you had to get that sweet spot in the middle. And it was a matter of professional judgment. And it was taken not by the SIO or his deputy necessarily, but it was taken with the team who'd been allocated to this person and said, you know him, you've done your homework, what do you feel about it? And you had to put your trust in your experienced DOs who, you know.
Yeah, detective officers. When you were a young detective officer or a DS, detective sergeant, Tom, bringing people in for questioning, were you the good guy or the bad guy?
I was always the good guy.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say it.
I've always been the good guy. As I said to you before,
You're making up for it now.
charm is my weapon. Yeah, when I met you, I decided to change.
Tom, back to the Zodiac murders
Yes.
then. So that's
Yes.
very much what's going on here. That we've got this team, and as you say, they were processing a lot of bodies, and they had to, didn't they, with the list of male courtships that it looks as though their victim was having at the time over the previous months to this.
Yeah, I think they were quite right to focus on her, on Darlene. I think that when you look at Darlene's life and you look at the boy's life, the guy who was shot as well, then common sense would tell you, logic would tell you, that there's much more chance of her being the primary target rather than him, or her being the reason why the attack was made.
Yeah.
And so I think that was right. And I was struck by, and I must admit, I started to, Alex was absolutely great about this. He talked about this fella, George,
Yeah.
who kept coming up. And we don't yet know what George's last name was because it was redacted, it was held back.
Yeah.
But from various sources, right from the early go, the police started to get information about George. You should see George. That would be George. Or what about George? George had a fixation. George wanted to date Darlene. Darlene didn't want anything to do with George, but at the same time used him. Would accept lifts from him and
Call him up for lifts.
Yes,
Take me to my work.
And trade on his affections to be facilitated. I feel that if I'd been an SIO sitting on that, I would have put my very best team. I would have probably asked the DI, in fact, to lead it, to really have a thorough look at George.
Yeah.
Because George said, oh, I've never handled firearms. Well, how do we know that? I would have done a full background on George. And my old boss, Hector Clark, who was the Robert Black case and the best detective I ever worked with, he would sometimes say, look, we're not going to interview this fellow or investigate this chap to try and prove it. What we've got to do is you've got to come back to me with absolute evidence to say it cannot be him.
Yes, yes.
So really eliminate him. So it's not, do we have positive evidence to say it was him? It's a fit the description, have we got fingerprints, etc., etc.? No, we've actually got to do an in-depth investigation to absolutely prove to ourselves that it was not him. Otherwise, he is a fly in the ointment because so many people and so many references come in from completely separate and independent sources. That would make me be very concerned that if it wasn't George, and if I was to go past George, and if I was to put my pen through George and say eliminated, then I would have to be convinced of it.
Do you not think he was eliminated satisfactorily here?
I haven't heard evidence of that so far. There's too many references to George. He's in all the wrong places at the right times. He's obviously got a fixation with her. He then pitches up and say, oh no, I'm happily married. I didn't care really about her. But the evidence suggests that he did, that he had a thing about Darlene. I would still
Was there not something, Tom, about he'd been in her house and threatened to rape her?
Yes, there's all of these different references, and he presents as something completely different to what
Yes.
the evidence says he was. We got all these independent people coming and saying, have you thought about George? Because of his behaviour, because of his obsession with her. I would not have been content that he was thoroughly alibied, and that I would not, at this stage, and we'll hear what Alex has got to say in the next episode, I would not be content that George was out of the picture. And again, I'm still keeping my mind open about the linking of these two cases.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just because George could not have committed the first crime, that doesn't eliminate him for me for the
Okay.
second crime.
Okay.
Because as we've discussed, in the second crime, there was a degree of relationship there. It was not a stranger killing.
Okay, Tom. So what we've got here is George, who sticks out because of the amount of sources. We used to have a thing in especially in criminal intelligence world, where one source was never enough. One source was enough to raise an eyebrow maybe and have a think about it.
Yeah.
But when you get two sources, then you can start thinking that you might have something here that could be corroborative, especially if the second source is totally independent of the first, that they couldn't have influenced each other.
Yeah.
And what we have here with George, because I have to say this, although I don't like speaking ill of Darlene or anyone else that's a young person that's found murdered in these circumstances, there was a wide range of male friends that she had, that she spent time with. It seems to be with the knowledge of her husband as well, so they might well have been friends. But going to lovers' lanes and places like that with these guys certainly raises our eyebrows. But George stuck out from that body of males. But the police had to go through all of them and TIE every single one of them. And they seem to have been working through them quite methodically.
They do, they have done, and I was pleased to see that. And you've also got to look at the statistics of these things, Simon, because the truth of the matter is, you and I both know, the chances of being attacked and killed by an absolute stranger are very, very remote, particularly if it's not a sexually motivated case. Now, in the case of The World's End, in the case of Robert Black, they were sexual predators.
Yes.
So they were attacking to satiate their sexual desires, and then they were killing to remove evidence. So that's a different thing. But actually, somebody just coming up and killing someone in the street without any connection and for absolutely no known reason, that's very rare. Very rare.
Yeah.
There's usually a connection. Now, in the first case we looked at, the first of the so-called Zodiac cases, it appears to be that very rare exception of the completely random killing, the one with the 2-2. But Darlene's murder, no,
with the phone calls and all the rest of it, Tom.
It still looks as if it's a connection there.
Yeah. And for that reason, you're still maintaining that they might not be linked?
I'm not saying they're not linked, but I'm putting myself in the position of the SIO, and I would not be putting these two investigations together at the moment. I'd have one on one side of my desk, I'd have the other on the other side of my desk, and I'd be constantly looking for the links, but I wouldn't shuffle the papers. Because once you shuffle the papers, Simon, you can never extricate them.
Yes. Tom, something else I was thinking of listening to this, it became obvious through Alex's methodical, even with times, the interviews, interviewing Darlene's mother, all that stuff that went on. Throughout it all, and I should say here that our listeners, to make sense of our summary here, really need to go and listen to the episode, because we don't repeat all the multitude of details and chronological events that Alec has researched. But something that struck me was that it became obvious to us, as it obviously did to the murder team, that Darlene was quite a girl about town by the looks of it. It looked as though she had a wide range of male friends in the area. Would that taint possible? I'm asking the question, and what I'm really saying is that could taint the attitude of the detectives that are looking into her murder because they think she's a certain type of girl.
Yeah, this comes back to something we've spoken about before, about the worthy and unworthy victim.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't. And I'm very pleased to say that in the system that I worked in, it never did. One of the most exhaustive murder investigations we carried out in my time was into the death of a sex worker, a street sex worker. Sheila Anderson, who had been written off by society, heroin addicted, young girl, tragic case, but there was no question of any sort of half measures in that case. We did everything and are still doing everything in order to detect that case. Just as a reminder, it's an interesting case. It's a case I was heavily involved in. I was the deputy SIO on that case. And it's season 1, episode 27 and 28.
Thanks for doing that, Tom, because I found that a very poignant couple of episodes. I think there was a lot in it. And as you say, it's still an open case.
Very much so, and still a case I hope will be solved. I remember when I was working in America, having a conversation about that case. I remember speaking to some detectives in the United States about that particular case, and they sort of looked at me quizzically and said, "What are you wasting your time for? It's just another hard luck story." But they were inundated by cases, and they had to make judgments as to where they could apply their resources, their very scarce resources. And so they did. They actually made a judgment about who was worthy and who was not worthy, which is something I'm glad to say that we never did, and we were never in a position where we had to do it, and I hope we never are.
I think it's the type of prejudice that pervades all sorts of aspects of our lives, Tom, not just police work.
Yeah.
And it's something that we were always guarding against. I went very much in the Harry Bosch corner here. You know who Harry Bosch is?
Yes, he's a fictional detective, much like yourself.
You think he's fictional. Him and I occupy the same world. But Harry always says either everyone matters or nobody matters.
Yeah,
So.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing to say, Simon, that in terms of forensic opportunities with George, what Alex didn't say, whether George had been thoroughly examined and swabbed for firearms residue. And because the big thing about George was he'd never had a gun and he'd never fired a gun and he didn't know anything about guns. You and I both know that firearms residue lasts a long time on your clothing and on your skin. And so was his house properly searched? Was his house forensically examined? Was there any indication of firearms residue at all on George to disprove this thing that he'd never used firearms? Because if he's been firing an automatic pistol, a 9mm automatic pistol, there's a lot of residue comes off these weapons.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to protect yourself from getting contamination of some sort.
Something maybe worth mentioning here, Tom, when we were on this episode talking about the TIE, the trace, interview and eliminate, is that if you sent me and someone else out to do that with maybe not a suspect at this stage, but someone of interest that has to be eliminated, you wouldn't have put a time limit on me. You wouldn't say, and I want you back here for 1 o'clock this afternoon. There's no time limit on that. It's as long as it takes. If I need to come back and forward and say to you, I'm not happy about this, we'll search his house, we'll do what we've got to do. There's no end to that process of elimination.
Yeah, that's right. But what you would do as an SIO or the admin would prioritise. The SIO or the deputy would prioritise and say, look, here is the priority to TIE this particular person. And teams, as you'll remember, Simon, teams would have half a dozen jobs to do.
Yeah.
And they'd be TIE, a number of people. And some of these people were witnesses. So, for instance, if they said, a witness said, oh yes, just before we found the body, I noticed a milkman or I noticed a baker's van, then there would be an action raised to TIE, the baker's van, and interview and find out what they've got. So it wasn't always direct people who might be suspects. It was also people who could fill in the peripheral story to it too.
Yeah.
But naturally, they would not be as high a priority as the people who, were of immediate concern. Because there's an old truth that you stand a much better chance of getting a result if you get onto it quickly. And if you can get someone in the cell, in the detention room within 24 hours, you've got a much better chance of getting some sort of result from them than if they've been off and running for 2 or 3 months and managed to convince themselves that they didn't do it and managed to destroy all the clothes and managed to make themselves clean and
all the forensics,
destroy all the forensics. So there is an urgency there in the initial stages. Yeah.
Let me put this to you, Tom. That sounds a bit like a lawyer, really, doesn't it? Let me put this to you. And this is a nuance of our work as detectives, and it probably wouldn't be discussed on other true crime podcasts or such like. But we can discuss it here because it's what we did for a living for many, many years. And I think it's what our listeners like us to prod with a wee stick and see what our thoughts are on it. Is that any detective going to trace, interview and eliminate, chaps a door and walks into a house to speak to someone, immediately forms an opinion, a first impression, if you like. And some people you like and you can get on with, and some people you maybe don't take to. And that can taint the depth of interview you do, the thoroughness of the interview you do, the thinking, well, definitely not him. I think he's telling me the truth, simply based on what you're observing rather than what you can prove.
Yeah, and this is where the systems come in. This is where Holmes and the computerized systems have really, because they wouldn't let you away with that. You wouldn't let this, oh, I don't think it was him. Nah, it'll not be him. This sort of thing. But you can't replace, no amount of technical aid will replace an experienced eye and a nose for these things. I remember we had a murder of a man down in Portobello, and I was DS on the investigation, and we had a very good description from a bus driver who more or less had seen the assault that led to the death. A very good description of the culprit, including distinctive tattoos and all the rest of it. And on the house-to-house team was a uniformed sergeant who had been a detective, and he'd been promoted into uniform. He came back to CID subsequently. He was doing his time in uniform as a uniformed sergeant. And he was doing house-to-house investigations, and he knocked on this door, and the guy answered the door. And this fella just thought, I don't like the look of you. He just had a sense there was something wrong. And he went into the house and he carried out a very thorough house-to-house investigation, and he noticed there was a pair of stained boots at the door, and he wasn't happy with that. And eventually he collared them and brought them in, and it turned out that he was the culprit, and the boots were still covered in the blood of the deceased man. And the thing about, there's two things, learning points with that. One was that you cannot replace that sense, that experience, that nose there is for these things. The other thing was that the description, the very good description, including the tattoos we had from the first-class witness, was entirely wrong.
Right, yeah.
Was entirely wrong. Not that the bus driver was trying to mislead us at all,
No.
but he had firmly something in his head that he thought he'd seen, and he'd reinforced that. And later, that was a big learning point for me, because later on we came across that in the Caroline Hogg case, where witnesses felt so pressured to have seen something and wanted to help so much, that they actually imagined themselves into situations where they'd seen something of note, where in fact they hadn't. And of course, that can send you running down the wrong track, because we were looking for someone with quite distinctive tattoos on their hands. And it turns out, thankfully, this chap who's still alive and still see him, he ended up a detective super, I think, and he just had the nose for it. And he just thought there's something wrong about this guy. This guy's responding wrongly to the uniform. He's edgy. What is it? And instead of ringing the alarm bells and calling for reinforcements, he just followed it up gently. He got into the house. He had a cup of tea with them. He gave him a chat. All the time looking around, see what there was, sees the boots, and eventually comes to conclusions. Hang on a minute. This guy is far too shifty. This guy has got something to answer for.
Sometimes it's quite subliminal, Tom, isn't it? It's not something you can put your finger on. It's just a gut feeling.
No, and you can't train it. You can't train for it, and you can't teach it.
Yeah.
It's just something that you have and you have not. And of course, what it is, it's experience.
Yes.
It's what
and your subconscious, Tom.
Yeah.
I used to find that I needed quiet time sometimes, just to go for a walk or do something completely different. Read my paper or read another file or something, and let my brain settle a wee bit round about it, and it can pop out sometimes.
What happened to me was I used to wake up in the middle of the night thinking, hang on a minute. Yeah. And I always kept, I have to confess to you, I still do keep a notebook and a pen beside my bed. But now, of course, it's nothing to do with solving crime. Now it's to do, here's a trick I can play on Simon. I'll write it down.
And how do you find it in the dark, or even with the light with no glasses or anything?
I don't wear glasses.
Tom, that's fascinating. I think Alex on to something here, isn't he? It's great. We started off by praising him with what he does, and I think we'll finish off on that note as well, because he's so thorough, so methodical, and he doesn't rush. He takes it step by step, and we're starting to see a bigger picture here regarding to this couple and the murder of Darlene.
Yep, very much so, Alex. Well done. Again, looking forward to next